My name is Megan Leslie. Welcome to this panel. I'm the president and CEO of WWF Canada, and I'm coming to you from Toronto. Toronto is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And it's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And the group of us for this panel, I'm the moderator, we were chatting before we came on, and we were talking about the fact that Toronto is also the dish with one spoon territory. And this is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee. And this treaty bound them to share territory and to protect the land. So this idea that we're all sharing one dish or we're sharing one territory with this one spoon, we have to limit what we take and leave enough for others. And the principles of this treaty should guide us all when we think about resources and the environment, when we think about food and food security, and what an amazing concept for us to embrace and build on our discussion today. So I am so honored to be moderating this panel, and I say honored with intention because the Royal Society of Canada and RSC Atlantic did a really great job of capturing their theme of a celebration of excellence and engagement when they pulled together this panel called Sustainable Oceans to Sustainable Diets. This interdisciplinary discussion is with some incredible leaders in their fields. Carly Kehoe, Barbara Neese, Tamara Soma, and Sarah Seck, and you'll hear from them in a minute. I have really enjoyed talking to them in the lead up to this panel, and I'm excited to see where this conversation goes today. I have some questions lined up for our panelists, and then afterwards we'll go to questions from the virtual floor. So please, if you have questions, just put them in the chat box. And with that, let's not waste a second of this. Let's get started. To set up the conversation, I wanted to point out that both the UN and the EU have recognized the urgency of sustainable diets, but even though they've recognized that urgency, I don't think we can just import their conclusions because Canada has some unique circumstances. We have this large landmass with 3 coasts. We have significant inland freshwater bodies. We have substantial climate and ecological differences between the different regions of Canada. We also have diverse cultures, and that includes dietary practices. We have extensive rural regions as well as densely populated cities. And importantly, we have a responsibility to reconciliation. So let's explore the issue of sustainable oceans to sustainable diets and what this could look like for Canada. Before we leap into what's happening now or what the future looks like, I know that a lot of aspects of our unique situation in Canada are really historically rooted. So Carly, you are the Canada Research Chair in Atlantic Canada Communities at St. Mary's University. Can you describe for us what is uniquely Canadian about the commercial fishery?
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Leslie. And also just to acknowledge, I'm speaking to you from Halifax, which is in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia is located in Mi'kma'ki, which is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And if we are talking about sustainable oceans and sustainable diets, we need to pay attention to that. From a historical perspective, and I spend a lot of my time in the 18th and 19th century with the tensions between Britain and France. But one thing that I always think about is it fair to say that when we're looking about uniquely Canadian, we have to understand that didn't exist for a really long time. And then even when there was European settlement, the idea that there was a sustainable fishery or sustainable diets around the fishery is, I don't think that that makes much sense. The reason why European settlement happened and why it started to expand around the coasts was because it was linked with this very complex global system of trade. Right. It revolved around money, it revolved around religious custom, it revolved around migration, people moving back and forth, both because they wanted to, but some who had no choice, and also consumption. It linked what would become Atlantic Canada with Europe, Africa, and also the Caribbean. There was a real link, for example, between the coastal communities that established themselves here and plantation slavery in the Caribbean, for example. And a lot of the coastal communities up here in the late 18th, early to mid 19th centuries they really depended on the fact that there was enslaved labor in the Caribbean. So these are some of the things that I think about as a historian when I'm thinking about a sustainable, like what does sustainability mean? And if we're looking at the trajectory of what would become a Canadian fishery, where did it actually come from? And it came out of this European design on commercializing a natural resource.
It doesn't sound very like it protects biodiversity or local ecosystems then. So that's really helpful context for the commercial fishery and the larger global forces at play. What did that look like on the ground?
Yeah, so on the ground, and I come from a fishing family on Isle Madame on Cape Breton, a lot of small coastal communities, and you have local economies that were structured around the fishery, local consumption, but I'm sorry, a cat. Local consumption, also international trade. But what I've also found was a lack of local power and hard lives and big families. And what was really fascinating about, so in the 20th century, the early 20th century, the 1930s, there was a shift in these small communities where they actually started to feel empowered, and these coastal communities started to feel empowered, where fishers and their families started to become able to advocate for themselves because of something two priests actually started, which was the Antigonish movement. And it was, you have a lot more to offer than what you're being told. And if you educate yourselves, you're going to be able to advocate. And when they started doing that, there was an enormous shift in what these coastal communities started to look like and how they started to empower themselves.
So that Antigonish movement is almost a bit of an Atlantic Canada, made in Atlantic Canada approach in some ways.
Tamara, yeah, absolutely.
Tamara, can I ask you, your research at Simon Fraser University looks at food system planning and circular economy. So you've got a great global lens here. So from the super local to the global, when we look globally, what could we build into a made in Canada approach? What are some opportunities that you see?
Thanks, Megan. And first of all, greetings of peace to all of my relations from Burnaby Mountain, BC, the unceded ancestral and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I just want to mention, because this is RSC Atlantic, you know, as the only panelist hailing from the Pacific, from Indonesia.
We like all oceans here, don't worry.
Exactly, specifically. You know, of course, as we all know, you know, just as we are all related, it is important to remember that in viewing the issue of sustainable oceans and sustainable diets in this Atlantic session, this is why we are doing things in an interconnected, interdisciplinary, and intersectional systems approach, because we know that what happens in the Atlantic will impact the Pacific and vice versa. So again, I'm so grateful to be amongst these wonderful and esteemed colleagues. And so again, talking about your question in terms of global, kind of from global to made in Canada, I think that there are key learnings that we can take from global, as well as alternative ways of knowing and underrepresented perspectives that can then be considered into a made in Canada approach, particularly for the Atlantic. And first of all, I would like to mention that a 2011 census in the Atlantic noted that Arabic is the third most commonly spoken language. You know, for example, in Nova Scotia, the Atlantic is in fact home to many diasporic communities, including those from Lebanon, which is my husband's family, Syria, Egypt, Kuwait, and many others. Islam is actually the second largest religion practice in Canada after Christianity. So I want to start by, you know, to recognize this demographic and underrepresented ways of knowing, I would like to start actually by sharing a 7th century prophecy in Arabic that is particularly relevant for this current issue, and pardon my Arabic. So it's Zaharal Fasadu fil Bari wal Bahri bima kasabat أيدي الناس ليذيقهم بعد الذي عملوا لعلهم يرجعون. And what it means in English is, corruption have spread on land and sea because of what humans' hands have wrought, that he may make them taste the fruit of some of their own doings, so that they may turn towards righteousness. So this 7th century prophecy is speaking about a time when there will be widespread human-induced harm and corruption, both on land and sea. And I immediately think, hint, hint, climate change. It says that basically we as a humanity will feel the consequences of our own doing, the consequences of the greed, the exploitation, the overconsumption, the commodification, and with the hope that we will eventually start realizing and learning from our mistakes and then turn our ship around towards that middle path, that path of balance and that path of sustainability. So as I say that, I think it's important to remember that sustainability is actually not a new concept or something that was just invented in the 1980s through the Brundtland Commission, with all due respect. Anishinaabe scholar, Dr. Deborah McGregor, and my former professor noted that sustainability is a responsibility given by the creator. And in a nutshell, quote, "It is the responsibility and knowledge to ensure the continuation of creation that would be passed on for thousands of generations." And then there's Métis scholar, Dr. Zoe Todd. She challenged this idea that fish are commodities. In fact, she argues that fish are more than human beings and they are kin. And so she argues that we have reciprocal responsibilities towards our ocean relations. So what I would say to conclude is, a made in Canada approach, I would argue, should consider these pluralities of knowledge.
Yeah.
Recognize the global diaspora that can contribute and have contributed to Turtle Island, and recognize this historical context. Particularly, I would say the most important thing is to center Indigenous ways of knowing that represents a counter perspective to the status quo. And so that would be my Made in Canada approach.
Thank you for that. Wow, Barb, I'm sure that the idea of just sustainabilities and a lot of the concepts that Tamara was talking about, I'm sure they resonate with you based on your sociology of work and political economy work at Memorial University of Newfoundland. So building on this, you've talked before about the full spectrum sustainability approach to oceans and fisheries. Can you share a little bit about that with us? And just a reminder that, yeah, I'm muted.
Sure, thanks,
yes.
Megan. Okay, so again, I'm at Memorial University in Newfoundland, and in our land acknowledgement, we respectfully acknowledge the territory in which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq and the Beothuk. So that doesn't include Labrador, but we'll focus on the island for now. So I agree with Carly and with Tamara. I think history matters a lot. And that there is a long history here. There are diverse knowledges. There are different kinds of understandings that we need to take into account as we try to figure out this problem of sustainable oceans and sustainable diets. In terms of history, and based on my knowledge, most of my work's on the Newfoundland and Labrador fishery, there's evidence of overharvesting by migrant fishers and settler populations that really go back to at least the 19th century in terms of cod, whales, seabird colonies, walrus. And then overharvesting really ramped up in terms of scale and impact after World War II with the arrival of the distant water fleets from many different parts of the world. And it culminated in what's been called the killer spike. It's peak landings followed by collapse that actually happened first in the late 1960s. We think of the 1990s, but it really happened the first time around in the 1960s. So there's a long history, millennia for Indigenous groups, of reliance on fisheries, for subsistence-based diets, including marine and coastal sources of food such as salmon and shellfish. And subsistence activities have always played a key role in settler population diets here as well. But the role of subsistence sourced and of commercial seafood in diets, at least in this province, has declined in recent years. And we think it was accelerated by the cod moratoria, the groundfish moratoria really, that happened in the 1990s. And one of the interesting things about those moratoria was that they made visible the subsistence fisheries that had always been there, but nobody paid any attention to them, and there were no data on them. Basically, all of a sudden, there was this problem. We have these subsistence fisheries, and similarly after they closed the salmon fisheries in Labrador and parts of Newfoundland as well. So, and we can of course see similar patterns globally, right? As marine regulation and fisheries management, coupled with problems of overfishing, the expansion of export markets, and so on, have really limited the access of many people to seafood as part of their diet, including even the people who live along the coasts in Canada and elsewhere. So in terms of how to shift from our current global fisheries and aquaculture value chains to value chains that have built into them not only commitments to ocean sustainability, but also to sustainable diets, I think what we're going to need, and other people have argued, like Prateep Nayak, a regime shift, really, towards what Paul Foley and others called in a recent publication, full spectrum sustainability. So we're not just thinking about ecological sustainability. We need to look at all of the different aspects. So ecological, economic, social, and cultural, and institutional and governance. So a fishery based on full spectrum sustainability, they argue, respects the ecological integrity of the ocean and its resources. It's ethical, it's responsibly governed, it's economically viable and technologically appropriate, it supports communities, it draws on local culture, heritage, and diverse knowledge systems, and it enhances the health and well-being and the public good of our resources. And it's concerned not just with maintaining biodiversity or preventing ecological degradation and encouraging diets that are both ecologically sound and healthy for people, but it's also concerned with supporting access to decent work and safe work and with social justice. And it has key elements of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries.
Thanks, Barb. That's, I don't know if you noticed, but your fellow panelists were taking some notes. It's good. It's good. So this idea of full spectrum sustainability, obviously rights has to figure in there somewhere. Sarah, you researched the intersection of human rights law, environment, and business law at Dalhousie University. So how do we take a human rights approach to this kind of work while also being conscious of current ecological realities? What's the marriage there?
Thank you. I am speaking from Halifax, also from the unceded and ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq. And I think I endorse everything my colleagues have said, and I will definitely build on this human rights theme. I think a human rights approach adds a lot. We see it in things like the small-scale fisheries guidelines, which take an important step in this direction. But it's important really to bring together the human rights perspective with the ecological piece. And so we see steps taken in this direction in the small-scale fisheries guidelines, for example, which adopt a human rights approach, but also address to a somewhat limited extent the vulnerabilities of small-scale fishing communities in the context of disaster risk and climate change, for example. So I think that leads to a crucial piece of the conversation. Any conversation about sustainable oceans and sustainable diets, no matter what the regional focus, has to be conscious of global ecological realities. And this includes notable climate and biodiversity crisis, related problems such as ocean pollution and ocean acidification. And we see an increasing number of United Nations bodies drawing attention to the human implications of these crises, often framing the problem through a human rights lens. That includes within it reference to a right to adequate food. And so for our conversation, the importance of sustainable fisheries, which of course are under threat from climate changing oceans, as well as global overfishing and plastic pollution and so on. So when we're thinking of the right to adequate food, one version of a definition is that it's said to be realized when everyone, including children, has physical and economic access at all times to adequate food or means for its procurement, corresponding to cultural traditions, while ensuring physically and mentally, individually and collectively, the fulfillment of a dignified life free of fear. There's a lot in that definition.
Yeah.
But certainly availability, accessibility, and adequate as being part of it. But of course, the problem is that climate change will and is already impacting other sources of food. So while we should think about, for example, fish as food in the region as part of a sustainable diet, as well as fisheries as supporting sustainable livelihoods, we also need to consider where other food comes from that flows into the region and how it is produced and harvested, as well, perhaps provocatively, of our responsibilities to contribute to the right to food of others outside the region who may have come to be dependent on food from the region for their own food security. On the other hand, a food sovereignty approach might suggest that people in the region and their need for food and sustainable livelihoods needs to be at the center of all policies, and food, including fish, must not be treated as a mere commodity to be traded by remote and unaccountable corporate enterprises, a theme we might come back to later in our discussions if we have time.
Thanks for that, Sarah. I was going to ask, when you were talking about the right to adequate food and what that means, I was thinking about what does that look like in the Atlantic context. You've already jumped into that a little bit, but I might ask, do you have more thoughts about the Atlantic context for that? I mean, it's going to depend on location, on gender, on indigeneity, on culture. There's so many factors here.
Right. So I'm going to, unfortunately, again, jump to sort of a bigger picture, but maybe this is a way to think about how we think about the Atlantic region. So I would say certainly the implications of climate and biodiversity crisis on the right to adequate food more generally differs depending on the existing vulnerabilities of the rights holders, which are often exacerbated due to violations of other rights. So for example, the rich who have contributed the most to anthropogenic climate change are often able to buy their way out of at least some of the most egregious consequences of climate change, while the poor who've contributed the least generally can't. So with that example, we can see that sort of food justice and climate justice dimensions are interrelated. And one helpful way of thinking about this is in relation to the 2018 UN Framework Principles on Human Rights and the Environment, which really highlight this interdependence. So a failure to protect the environment violates human rights, but violations of human rights also undermine environmental protection, and by extension, rights to food and food security. Mm-hmm. In related work, I draw on insights from feminist and relational approaches to legal analysis to suggest we need to think critically about how we think about who the human is at the center of all aspects of law and policy. And so we can extend that to how we approach the Atlantic context. So for example, when we think of the holder of the right to adequate food, are we unconsciously thinking of someone with a well-paying job, a house, a car, who can drive to the supermarket or even dine at expensive restaurants where they can choose to pay more for sustainably harvested foods, or choose not to if you don't want to? Or are we thinking of a child growing up in a household of small-scale fishers whose next meal depends on the continued viability of the local fishery and a stable ocean climate system? And do we think of the bounded autonomous individual from the first model as having a right to choose to buy foods that are not the product of socially and ecologically resilient food systems? Or should we acknowledge that every human, consciously or not, is an ecologically embedded relational human who's differentially situated? And so with rights to food come responsibilities to the fish, to planet, to future generations, to each other. So I'm not sure if that helps, but a related question, I guess, that's strictly Atlantic comes to mind when I think of the Mi'kmaq right to a moderate livelihood fishery, mm-hmm. Because maybe we should ask who has a right, or should anyone have a right to an immoderate livelihood fishery or to access unsustainable food?
That's a great question, and sets us up perfectly, I think. That kind of thinking sets us up perfectly for what I want to ask next of Barb, because we've got this great framing for action. So now to action. With all of these considerations in mind, and whether it's the theoretical framework to looking at history to taking from global examples, what do we need to do to build this for Atlantic Canada, Barb?
Well, I think a lot of researchers have shown that the current Atlantic Canadian fisheries and oceans systems are better than in some other parts of Canada and some other parts of the world. And I think it's really important to remember that. If we contrast Atlantic Canada, for example, with British Columbia, in terms of what has happened to their fisheries and the separation of those fisheries from communities and from access to communities. But we're still, and we still have a strong community basis with small scale fisheries here. We have increasing indigenous control and engagement, and I think that's a really good thing and a really important thing, and is part of reconciliation. But there's lots more that needs to be done and can be done. And I think we need to change some of the foundations and core structures, including by redistributing access, wealth, and decision-making power, and by developing social, cultural, economic, and governance structures and infrastructures using a full spectrum sustainability approach. So yeah, that's the broad beginning. Do you want me to get more specific?
Yeah, what could it look like? Tell us what it could look like.
Sure, okay. All right, so it's a big question, but yeah. Let me just spark some thoughts. So in 2014, we released a policy paper where we called for reinvestment in and revitalization of the Newfoundland Labrador fisheries and fishing communities. The entire sector had been dominated by a downsize model ever since the cod collapse, really. So fewer fishermen, fewer plants, fewer everything. And we said, this is not getting us where we want to go. We need to think about reinvestment and revitalization. So we talked about the strengths. We do have, I think, a global obligation in terms of food. So, and it does make sense to have an offshore fishery. It's part of the strength, but not by itself. We also have inshore, we have coastal and subsistence fisheries. So there are good things. The small scale fisheries are still here, but we have a lot of vulnerabilities. And I think that those vulnerabilities are relevant to the discussion today. They include the ways that coastal communities are losing access to the marine resources on their doorstep due to policies focused on downsizing and privatizing access to fisheries and to coastal areas, as with intensive aquaculture. They include the lack of information about marine ecosystems and fisheries in the school curriculum, and the fact that locally sourced seafood is not served in schools or at other institutions in this province, partly due to concerns about allergies. We noted the focus on mass production of a narrow range of species and products for export, to the neglect of local and regional consumption in markets and ways to support and diversify them. And we noticed that fisheries and tourism initiatives were largely handled separately, ignoring the potential synergies between the sectors and unnecessarily weakening both. We noted the dwindling engagement of local community governments and municipalities in marine and coastal management and in fisheries decision-making, and the weakness of regional government, which we thought was essential to a more integrated, locally embedded approach to governance. We documented people were eating less seafood over time and talked about the need to think in terms of a 100-mile seafood diet. And we talked about poor wages and working conditions and the vulnerability of people who work in the industry, and the dwindling number of plants, which are critical to providing employment and also revenue to support service development. So those are just some of the things that we talked about. We talked a lot about a lot of the others, but I think to get to those things, it's not just a question of tinkering. The only other thing I'll say is that since that time, a few things have changed that we had recommendations on, but lots of things have not changed. And if anything, I think one of my concerns is with COVID, and the financial situation, at least in this province, of governments, that we are at greater risk of essentially selling off our natural resources and increasingly losing control, rather than reinvesting and revitalizing.
Barb, for those who are watching that policy paper, where could people find it if they wanted to take a look?
It's on a website. It's www.curra.ca. It was a Curra project.
Great, thanks for sharing that, and thanks for connecting all those dots. Yeah, that was a nice visual exercise that you took us through as well. Sustainable diets and seafood, I think, do offer an opportunity to support our environment on terms that just aren't about health, but are also about the economy. They're economically viable, they're culturally sensitive, supportive of reconciliation, and can be responsive to both urban and rural needs and aspirations. So Tamara, from a food system planning perspective, your area of expertise, what do we need to connect those dots from ocean to table?
Sounds good. And I am a registered land use planner. And when people think like, how does the land use plan, what does that have anything to do with the ocean? Well, I will tell you.
Please do, bring it.
So food system planning has a major role in supporting a more sustainable ocean-related diet, that whole ocean to table approach. So for those who are new to the term food system planning, basically it is a set of interconnected, forward-thinking activities that strengthen a community's food system through the development and implementation of plans and public policies that influence and shape how food is produced, harvested, processed, distributed, accessed, purchased, consumed, or disposed. It's basically the field that helped what Barbara was all talking about, that put the dots together. Because it is systems-wide in its approach, those working in this field of mine, food system planning, recognize the need to consider multi-jurisdictional approaches, which is very key in sustainable oceans. And also, there's a group of us called food system planners. And basically, people like me, we work to bring people together to facilitate stakeholder and community engagement, to support systems mapping, and identify key assets in the community that can be utilized to facilitate a more sustainable food system and a more sustainable seafood supply chain. So to connect the dots from ocean to table, it's critical, obviously, that we invest in local and regional food infrastructure. Everything from canneries, which has seen significant decline, to smokehouses for indigenous communities, to better cooling, storage, and processing infrastructure. I love this term that this scholar, Dr. Lori Stahlbrand, identified. She calls it the infrastructure of the middle. And this term refers to the resources and networks that creates a critical mass and enable small to medium scale food producers, in this case fishers, to meet the need of the consumers. And they work closely together, particularly with public sector institutions, because they can play a very strong role in supporting local food procurement. And what I would argue is that this investment in local food infrastructure not only will improve economic development, job creation, but I think it could help facilitate better tracing, because that distancing process allows for exploitation, allows for wastage, and that shortening of the food supply chain allows for hopefully more transparency, because as we all know, there's a lot of mislabeling. Studies from Canadian Food Inspection Agency and organizations like Oceana has found rampant mislabeling of fish in retail and in restaurants. And so this investment in local food infrastructure can kind of reconnect and challenge that distancing forces.
Thanks. And Barb, I want to say thanks. We did have a question from Angela saying there's so many good reports on Cura. What was the name of the title? So if you're interested in that report, Barb's put the link to it in the chat. And there's also a policy booklet, she says. So, and if you have questions for any of our panelists, look, real-time answers. Just throw it in the chat. So when we're back to the connecting these dots, when we're connecting the dots from ocean to table, Sarah, can we apply a human rights approach to business responsibilities as we're connecting these dots? Is there room for that?
Thanks. I think there is. And I should note, I come to this conversation, at least to the fish and food Atlantic conversation fairly recently, having spent most of my time thinking about other industry contexts. So what I find interesting about this is that it's increasingly well developed in other areas, the idea that businesses have a responsibility to respect human rights, that this is an independent responsibility, and it extends to intersections with climate change. And we see guidance, for example, coming out from the OECD in conjunction with the FAO on agricultural supply chains, for example. But we don't seem to see so much, in fact, anything really in the fisheries and food context. So the small scale fisheries work certainly does take some steps in this direction. But for example, the Marine Stewardship Council's certification process is clearly a big player in this area, but it really doesn't seem to take into account the social dimensions, and certainly not a human rights approach. And doesn't, I understand that there are challenges in achieving certification for some small scale fisheries, including indigenous fisheries. So I think my sense is that there's a lot of work to be done in this area in bringing the work that's happened in other contexts, the endorsement of the idea of business responsibilities to respect human rights, bringing that with the work on human rights and environment into this fisheries and food sustainable, small scale sustainable diets conversation. But I think this is fairly new. What one could hope is that this could enable, and I would suggest fishers, fish workers, their communities and their organizations to claim their rights from duty bearers, which would include states and the private sector. But we have to clarify what that actually means. And as I say, I think there's work to be done there.
Sounds like. Thanks, Sarah. This is my last question for our amazing panelists. So I just want to remind folks, if you would like to ask a question, to put it in the chat. Tamara, I'm going to go to you because we're talking about harvesting, we're talking about legal structures, we're talking about community, and I think the issue of sustainable diet and sustainable oceans really goes beyond individual consumption. It goes beyond better choices, making better choices. We've explored that a little bit. And it may even start with fish loss or waste at the point of harvest, fish waste at the point of consumption and packaging. Can you talk a little bit more about the global issue of waste as it relates to seafood? This is Eddie, by the way. He's like, oh, they're talking about fish waste. He's here for it. Can you tell us a little bit more about the global issue of waste as it relates to seafood, and how can we potentially address that issue?
Absolutely. So I will start by asking everyone, what is food and what is waste?
Great question. Yeah.
I call an investigation to find all of the missing salmon heads, the missing fish tails in the supermarket. Where are they? The lost cod tongues, except in Newfoundland, and other seafood tidbits that are being discarded because the industry and a large enough group in our society basically view these tidbits as waste, as without value. So I feel that in the commodification of our ocean relations and their flesh in terms of what is valuable, so the flesh, the body of the salmon is valuable, but the head is not, or the tail is not, is that we've ended up wasting so much. The thing is, in Canada, the issue of wasted fish loss is so understudied. So we actually have very little information, and I think we need urgent research into this issue. There are potentially similar issues, though, that I think we can learn from our neighbors in the South, from the United States. So according to a study by Love et al., seafood is wasted across the entire supply chain, and nearly half, so 47% of edible US seafood supply was lost annually from 2019 to 2013. And the majority of the waste occurs at the consumer level, both within the home and outside of the home. So like, for example, like when people go out for takeout or restaurants and what have you, and then by commercial fishers, and then at the retail level. But then beyond that, there's also the issue of bycatch, the loss of other animals' lives, like dolphins, sea turtles, that were not even intended for human consumption. And the scale of this issue continues to grow with the scale of industrial fishing. So when we're speaking about sustainable diet and nutrition, the conservative calculation estimates that this fish waste represents the waste of 208 billion grams of protein, 1.8 trillion milligrams of omega-3 fatty acids, and 1.1 trillion kilocalories. So these are staggering numbers. But then also, in addition to that, there's other associated waste, including marine plastic pollution. And significant plastic pollution has impacted our ocean relations because, you know, fish, their reproductive system are being impaired, their bodies are inflamed from the plastic. And for us, you know, it can potentially lead to the leaching of harmful chemicals and blood clots and so many different issues. And so I think what's important for us to remember is that the issue of plastic waste in the marine environment starts from the land. And this land-based issue is impacting our ocean relations. So I want to quote Memorial University, an Atlantic scholar, Dr. Max Liboron, who noted so poignantly in her Teen Vogue article, disposable plastics are simply not possible without colonizers' access to land. The end of colonialism will result in the end of plastic disposability. So I will conclude by saying that the end of colonialism will be that turning point for us to rebuild the relations with the ocean and the more than human beings whose existence many of us depend on, and who also depend on us to ensure their continued existence. And I hope we need to do it now, not wait till later. So. Yeah.
Wonderful. And you're being thanked in the chat already for that challenge. So Colette noted thanks for the challenge and is wondering what happens. Do you know what happens to most fish waste? Is it just disposed of? Is it where? So where are those salmon heads?
Yes, and so in some cases where there are certain factories that might see a market, for example, in another country, the fish head might be exported somewhere else. But in other cases, it could be destroyed, it could be landfilled, it could be rendered. There's so many different things. But I think in general, the size and the scale of it is the big problem. Is that nutrient is not cycling back. That nutrient loss is not cycling back. Yeah.
Carly, before I get to the next question, I wanted to come back to you because I realized you were at the very beginning of the panel and you've been listening to your fellow panelists, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to reflect on anything that they had to say.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it links with what Tamara just said, but also with this broader legacy of colonialism, but also British imperialism. And I mentioned this before, and I didn't know if we were going to have time, and I'm making a little bit of time. In addition to the plastics that we have in the fish, we also have to be aware that there are other things in the ocean that are causing significant worry and should be causing significant worry. And after the Second World War, for example, Canada had a responsibility as one of the allies to help to get rid of the leftover munitions. And what did they do with those leftover munitions? Well, a lot of them got dumped off the coast of Atlantic Canada and between Scotland and Ireland. Mustard gas is leaching out of old barrels, old drums. That's in the fish too. Mm-hmm. And so we have to be aware of all of these different things. And I wanted to flag that just in connection to what Tamara had just said. But Canada didn't really have a choice about taking those munitions. And that is linked, that goes way back as well, in terms of the relationship between Britain and what were the colonies, what became the Commonwealth after the Second World War.
Everybody's got a cat. I can hear yours in the background too. Oh, sorry. So there is a question here from Mary Pat about fish farming and sustainable oceans and a sustainable diet. Thinking about that question broadly, probably all of you have something you want to contribute on that. Any takers first up? All right, Barb, over to you.
Yeah, I think I think aquaculture has the potential, obviously, to generate lots of food, and is globally generating a lot of food, and has the potential to take some of the pressure off of wild fish stocks if it's done well. My issue really is with the focus on salmon, on top level feeders, if you like, and on a high-tech and intensive aquaculture. That's where I see the real issue. I'm quite concerned about the level of investment in research and development and so on, including from the Canadian government, that goes into more and more fine-tuning and tinkering of more and more intensive types of activities, and how little we're investing in something like integrated aquaculture, where you've got shellfish and you've got seaweeds and so on and so forth, and also the turning over of vast ocean spaces, like most of Placentia Bay, for example, to a single company. Yeah. The volatility in that sector. There are a lot of questions that I think we all need to be asking as Canadians, and really also how it potentially further alienates coastal peoples' control of access to potential to diversify the use of coastal areas. There are a huge number of very important questions here that we all have to be asking. And again, salmon is an elite food. It requires little fish to grow big fish. I know they're trying to change that, but it's still an elite and expensive food. And I think if the issue is sustainable diets, we need to be looking at other things and making sure that that's our focus more than salmon.
Mm-hmm. Tamara, I wondered if you had global perspectives to add to that.
Yes, so I grew up seeing neighbors and friends have small scale catfish you know, farming. And it's like, it's even something that you can do in your backyard or in a community scale. And also because catfish are very ravenous eaters, they will eat food scraps. So that's what my neighbors would feed the catfish. So it's just, again, it's just kind of the, I think that like what Barbara was mentioning, it seems like the focus on salmon alone is quite limiting, and we might want to consider other options as well.
So drawing from some of the questions here, when we're talking about food security, a lot of our aquatic food is exported. And so there's a question about how could we keep more aquatic food in our country, and also consumer acceptance. I mean, some of the things that we export are things that we're not going to eat here, or don't have much of a market for here, and vice versa. So thinking about that idea of the exportation of our seafood, anyone like to weigh in on that? All right, Carly.
It's just something to share based on family conversations. It has to make an equal amount of money in order to keep it in the country as opposed to shipping it out. Lobster and crab particularly, gets high prices outside of the country. And so if you're thinking about a local economy, which are actually quite big businesses, some of these fishers, it has to be made economically viable.
Barb, I think this has been an issue in Newfoundland in particular.
Yeah, so I mean, I think first of all, I think it's not straightforward that people will suddenly start eating a whole bunch of different things, right?
Yeah.
Although it's fascinating how many people now eat sushi. If you think about the traditional North American diet, it didn't include raw fish for the most part, and now it's widespread. So, I mean, I think that there are examples that we can look at. However we feel about sushi. The point is there are examples that we can look at in terms of the diversification of diets. The second thing is that diets are not homogeneous. Canada has many, many different peoples who live here, everything from indigenous to people from all over the world, and that's true globally. And I think part of my thought has always been, if we had, stronger immigrant communities in Atlantic Canada, if they actually had access to fisheries as immigrants, and so they were actively engaged, they were given opportunities to develop processing facilities, it could both diversify and improve access to different types of seafood within the region, and have the potential to develop new export industries in niche markets. But the whole structure of, just a few plants and just a few products and just, mass production really has worked against that kind of creative opportunity.
Yeah, very much. And Colette asked a similar question along these same lines, the perspective of opening up Canadians' openness to eating a diversity of locally harvested fish. But what you're saying is it's also about access to the fishery, because maybe we do have these diverse palates and these diverse cultural experiences with seafood, but we just don't necessarily have access that way. Bill is noting that there were 8,000 tons of seaweed imported into the US in 2019, and it grows like a weed in coastal Canada. So we're exporting quite a bit. Sarah, you've unmuted. Go ahead.
So I think building on that, I think it's interesting to reflect not only on how we could keep certain parts of the food here, but also to reflect on what is all the stuff that's coming in here that doesn't necessarily need to be here. But more importantly, or perhaps sort of embedded in that, is the fact that there are no real restrictions on the sustainability and the rights respecting nature of which this food is harvested, and fish included, coming from other parts of the world, that's sort of making its way into here. So you walk into a supermarket and you see all kinds of stuff. And I always sort of reflect when I walk into a supermarket, like, where did all this stuff come from? Why is it all here? Why should it be here? Do we need, California strawberries throughout the year? And what is this doing to the water systems in California? And why don't we care about that? Why isn't that something that's crucially important? And that's just, California water systems, which I think about from attending a few conferences at, ASU sustainability conferences, and meeting a lot of Americans who are really concerned about water tables. but we have lots of almonds coming in from there, you know? So, I mean, I think, again, for me, it's just always important to sort of do the flip, right? What we want to keep stuff here, but also let's think about what is coming in here and why and how, and what's wrong with our systems that it's all so easily available here when maybe it shouldn't be. Yeah. But we should be concerned about that.
Yeah, very much. And Tamara?
Yeah, and I just want to kind of further support what Sarah was just mentioning, is that the retailers are the curators of what we eat. You know, if you go to a museum, a curator has selected what you will be exposed to. And similarly, that's also the same with the supermarket. And because many of us, most Canadians, are so dependent on the supermarket system, and there's such a consolidation in the retail market, then it's, you know, even if we wanted to, it's hard because we might not actually have the choice to, unless we, you know, search the internet widely, or we know someone who knows someone, and then we might be able to get that, you know, that access to a particular food that we want to. So I think we really need to put, you know, a strong emphasis on supermarkets and how they can do things better, or maybe alternative retail market options that would support Canadian fishing industry.
Thanks. All right, we're getting close to the end of our time. So what I'm going to do is go to each of the panelists just for any closing thoughts or anything that maybe you felt you didn't have the time, or reflections on your fellow panelists. Barb, I'll go to you first. Sorry, I should have sent you a chat message. Any final thoughts that you want to share with our audience today?
Well, I kind of flipping when you go into the supermarket and looking at what's around. But I think the other thing is, you know, when I worked with Kristen Lowett because I haven't done a lot of research on, you know, kind of food sustainability or food systems, you know, the notion of a seafood desert in a region that is surrounded by a productive ocean, you know, so that people's diets are not as good as they could be. They have to drive a long way to chain stores, and those chain stores are bringing food in from all over the place, but it's not anywhere near as good or as valuable or potentially valuable to their diet as what's next door to them. The second point I'd make is that when we think about waste, I think we have to not just think about the fish. I think we really have to think about the waste in terms of human ingenuity and in terms of human capacity. Part of my concern is that fewer and fewer Newfoundlanders have the opportunity to be comfortable on the ocean, to see through, you know, the lens of fisheries or whatever, what's going on under the sea. Like, that is a waste to me. And it leads to, I think, an underutilization and a lack of knowledge of your own back door that is amplified much, much higher as we move out across the globe. And we undervalue our stewardship activities, right? We are doing stewardship, and we need to value that, and we need to market the stewardship and the energy that's invested in stewardship here in ways that we just don't.
Oof, Barb, the waste of human ingenuity hurt my heart. Oh, those were powerful closing words. Thank you. Carly, any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, and thanks to my fellow panelists for just making me think a lot about a number of things. I'm gonna have to do a lot of reading. One thing I am conscious of is that we don't lose sight of the people on the ground who rely on the fishery to survive. And they come from communities where it's not just the fishing family that needs this economy, it's entire communities. And I think that any decisions that are made or any moves towards some of these, like sustainability, is absolutely necessary. But these communities and these fishers need to be part of that conversation so that they can co-create solutions. Because I'm always very conscious of people feeling left out of a conversation, and confidence levels in rural Nova Scotia, and I can speak only for rural Nova Scotia, they could do with a bit of a boost sometimes. And so I think we need to keep that in the back of our minds.
Yeah.
That's hungry. I'm really sorry.
It's time. Co-creating those solutions. I love that. I love that idea. Sarah, what about you?
Well, it's difficult to add to what's already been said. I absolutely endorse what everyone else has said, and Barb's comments Carly's comments in terms of focusing on the communities and the ingenuity and the potential. For myself, I guess the closing comment is just that this has been a really great experience for me. I've recently returned to the Atlantic provinces after quite a long time away. I grew up in Newfoundland at the time of the cod crisis, so I'm very conscious of what that meant for the province and what that means, what fish means for communities in this region. And I think it's really important not to lose that. I guess my last comment would be that for myself, I'm going to reflect a lot more on how the work I've done in other contexts, particularly the mining context, actually could apply here and what work needs to be done. And I look forward to our further conversations.
Well, we're glad to have you and your thoughts and your ideas on these issues, that's for sure. Tamara, any closing comments from you?
Yes, so 3 words, all my relations. It's a paradigm that was taught to me by my colleague Erin Mills from Couchiching First Nations, and I think there's 2 components to all my relations. So in terms of ocean relations, it really makes us kind of understand our interconnectivity with the seaweeds and the crabs and the fishes and everything else around the ocean. But also on the other part, in the human context, that there are global diaspora community that may have made their home in Canada, people like me. And I think that, with all of us working together, I think we could really make something beautiful happen and really address this issue. And so thank you so much for giving me the voice and the space to contribute my perspective.
All our relations. Thank you. Thanks very much to our panelists today. This was a wonderful conversation. I certainly learned a lot, and I can see from the chat that a lot of what you said was really resonating with people. Thanks to the Royal Society of Canada and RSC Atlantic for pulling together this panel. And like I said at the beginning, really capturing that theme of celebration of excellence and engagement when they pulled together this panel called Sustainable Oceans to Sustainable Diets. And thank you all for joining us. I hope that you enjoyed this session.